The telegram arrived at dawn with news that would change everything. Her sister Margot had been spotted in a dusty settlement called Steins Pass, New Mexico, 300 miles from their family home in Santa Fe, and Hannah Everly wasn't going to waste another moment before setting out to bring her back. Hannah had been searching for Margot for 6 weeks now, ever since her younger sister had disappeared in the middle of the night with nothing but a carpet bag and a note saying she couldn't marry the banker their father had chosen for her. The scandal had nearly destroyed their mother, and their father had forbidden anyone to speak Margot's name in the house. But Hannah couldn't abandon her sister, no matter what foolish choices she'd made. At 24, Hannah was 3 years older than Margot and felt responsible for not seeing the signs, not realizing how desperate her sister had become. The stagecoach journey to Steins Pass took 4 grueling days across New Mexico territory in the scorching heat of August 1882. Hannah sat pressed against the window, her traveling dress sticking to her skin despite her best efforts to remain presentable. The other passengers, a whiskey drummer and an older couple heading to visit family, kept to themselves mostly, which suited Hannah fine. She had too much on her mind to make pleasant conversation. When the stage finally rattled into Steins Pass, Hannah's first impression was that her sister had chosen the most God-forsaken place in the territory to hide. The town consisted of a single dusty street lined with weathered buildings that looked like they'd blow away in a strong wind. A saloon, a general store, a boarding house, a blacksmith, and a few other structures she couldn't immediately identify made up the entirety of the settlement. Mountains rose in the distance, brown and forbidding under the merciless sun. Hannah climbed down from the stage, her legs unsteady after days of travel. The driver handed down her trunk, and she stood there in the street, suddenly uncertain. Where did one even begin looking for someone in a place like this? You look lost, miss. The voice came from behind her, deep and rough with something that sounded like exhaustion. Hannah turned to find a man standing in the shadow of the stage office, and her breath caught despite herself. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes so blue they seemed almost startling in his sun-bronzed face. He wore dusty work clothes and a hat that had seen better days, and there was something in his expression that spoke of old pain carefully hidden. "I'm looking for someone," Hannah said, lifting her chin. "My sister. She would have arrived here perhaps a month ago, young, blonde, pretty. Her name is Margot." Something flickered across the man's face, gone too quickly for Hannah to identify. "Lot of people pass through Steins Pass." "Can't say I recall anyone by that description." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "You come all the way from Santa Fe alone. How did you know I'm from Santa Fe? Stage manifest." He nodded toward the office. "I work at the station sometimes when they need an extra hand. Name's Xavier Easton." Hannah Everly. She didn't offer her hand, wasn't sure why she felt so off balance around this stranger. "Do you know where I might find lodging, and perhaps someone who could tell me if they've seen my sister?" Xavier pushed away from the wall, moving with a careful deliberation that suggested old injuries. "Mrs. Morrison runs the boarding house. She knows everyone who comes and goes. I can take you there." He picked up her trunk before she could protest, hoisting it onto his shoulder with an ease that belied his lean frame. Hannah followed him down the dusty street, acutely aware of the curious stares from the few people they passed. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough, but with Xavier Easton carrying her luggage, she imagined the gossip was already starting. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that looked slightly more substantial than its neighbors. Xavier set her trunk on the porch and knocked, then stepped back as if he didn't want to be seen too close to the door, A plump woman with graying hair answered, her eyes sharp despite her welcoming smile. "Xavier, what brings you by, and who's this, Mrs. Morrison? This is Miss Everly from Santa Fe. She's looking for lodging and information about her sister who might have passed through town." Mrs. Morrison's expression shifted to something sympathetic. "Come in, dear. Xavier, you can bring that trunk inside. Don't stand there like a stranger." The interior of the boarding house was clean and surprisingly comfortable, with lace curtains and furniture that spoke of care despite its age. Mrs. Morrison led Hannah to a small but tidy room on the second floor while Xavier followed with the trunk. "Now then, Mrs. Morrison said once Xavier had departed, though Hannah noticed he'd only gone as far as the parlor downstairs. "Tell me about this sister of yours." Hannah explained the situation, leaving out the most shameful details of Margot's flight from an arranged marriage. Mrs. Morrison listened carefully, her face growing more troubled as Hannah spoke. "I'm sorry, dear, but I haven't seen anyone matching that description. I'd remember a young woman traveling alone. It's not common, and I make it my business to know who's in my town." She hesitated. "Are you certain she came to Steins Pass?" Hannah's heart sank. "The telegram said she'd been spotted here. Who sent the telegram? It wasn't signed. I assumed it was someone trying to help." Hannah pressed her fingers to her temples, feeling a headache building behind her eyes. 6 weeks of searching, following every lead, and now this one seemed as empty as all the rest. "You look exhausted," Mrs. Morrison said gently. "Why don't you rest, and then we can ask around town properly. Someone might have seen something." Hannah wanted to protest, to start searching immediately, but she was so tired her bones ached. She nodded, and Mrs. Morrison left her alone in the small room, but sleep wouldn't come despite her exhaustion. After an hour of lying on the bed staring at the ceiling, Hannah rose and washed her face in the basin, then headed downstairs. She found Xavier Easton still in the parlor, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, staring out at the street with that same haunted expression she'd noticed before. "I thought you'd left," she said. He looked up, something almost like relief crossing his face before he shuddered it away. "Wanted to make sure you were settled. This isn't the safest place for a woman alone. I can take care of myself. Didn't say you couldn't." He stood, setting down the cup. "But if you're going to ask questions around town, you might want someone with you. People here don't trust strangers easily, and a woman on her own asking about a runaway sister, well, that might make folks uncomfortable." Hannah bristled at the implication but recognized the truth in his words. "And you're offering to help me? Why?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment, and Hannah saw something raw in his eyes before he looked away. "Because I know what it's like to lose someone. To spend every waking moment wondering if they're safe, if they're coming back. Wouldn't wish that on anyone." The pain in his voice was so genuine that Hannah's defensiveness crumbled. "Thank you. I would appreciate your help." They spent the rest of the afternoon going from business to business in Steins Pass. Xavier introduced her to the saloon keeper, the store owner, the blacksmith, the station master. Everyone was polite, but had the same answer. No young blonde woman traveling alone had come through town in the past month. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, Hannah felt despair settling over her like a heavy blanket. They stood outside the general store, the last place they'd checked, and she fought against the burning in her eyes that threatened tears. "She's not here," Hannah said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts. "Another dead end. Another wasted journey. What if I never find her? What if something terrible has happened and I'm just chasing shadows?" Xavier stepped closer, and for a moment she thought he might touch her shoulder, offer some gesture of comfort, but he kept his hands at his sides. "Don't give up yet. We can send telegrams to the surrounding towns, ask if anyone's seen her. Sometimes information takes time to travel. You keep saying we. Hannah looked up at him, this stranger who'd spent his entire afternoon helping her search. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't know my sister. The setting sun caught his face, highlighting the sharp angles and the weariness that seemed carved into his features. Maybe I need something to focus on besides my own troubles. Maybe I need to feel useful again. He paused, then added quietly, maybe I see someone who needs help and for once I can actually provide it. There was a story there, Hannah knew, layers of pain and loss hidden beneath those simple words, but she didn't press, just nodded. Thank you, Xavier, truly. They walked back to the boarding house in comfortable silence. Mrs. Morrison had dinner ready, and she insisted Xavier stay to eat with them. Over beef stew and fresh bread, Hannah learned more about Steins Pass and the hard life people led in this harsh corner of the territory. After dinner, Xavier excused himself, but not before telling Hannah he'd be by in the morning to help send those telegrams. Hannah watched him go from the parlor window, noting the slight hitch in his gait, the way he held himself like someone bracing against constant pain. He's a good man, Mrs. Morrison said from behind her. Though he's been through hell and back. Hannah turned. What happened to him? Mrs. Morrison settled into her rocking chair, picking up her knitting. Not my story to tell, dear, but I will say this. Xavier Easton arrived in Steins Pass 6 months ago looking like death itself. Barely spoke, barely ate. Took work where he could find it, kept to himself. You're the first person I've seen him talk to like that. Like he's actually present in the conversation, instead of lost in whatever darkness haunts him. That night, lying in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this frontier town, Hannah thought about blue eyes filled with pain and a voice rough with suppressed emotion. She'd come here looking for Margot, had expected nothing from this place except, hopefully, a reunion with her sister. She hadn't expected Xavier Easton. Morning came with the sound of a rooster and the smell of coffee. Hannah dressed quickly in a fresh traveling outfit, determined to make the most of this day even if the search seemed hopeless. When she came downstairs, Xavier was already there, hat in hand, talking quietly with Mrs. Morrison. "Morning," he said when he saw her. "Ready to send those telegrams." They walked to the station together in the cool morning air. The telegraph operator, a wizened old man named Pete, took down the messages Hannah wanted sent to every town within 100 miles. While they waited to see if any immediate responses came through, Xavier suggested they get breakfast at the small restaurant next to the saloon. Over eggs and bacon, Hannah found herself asking the question that had kept her awake much of the night. "What brought you to Steins Pass, Xavier?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her. "I had a ranch up north in Colorado. Small place, but it was mine. Built it from nothing with my own hands." He paused, fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "Had a younger brother, too, Lucas. He was 17, full of dreams about expanding the ranch, making something of ourselves." The past tense hung heavy in the air. Hannah waited, not pushing, letting him tell the story in his own time. "Raiders came one night last winter. We'd had some trouble with a gang operating in the area, but I thought we were too small, too insignificant for them to bother with. I was wrong." His jaw clenched. "They wanted our horses. I refused. There was a fight. I took a bullet to the ribs, another to the shoulder. Woke up 2 days later to find out Lucas had died trying to defend the ranch. He'd taken a bullet meant for me." Hannah's chest tightened with sympathy. "Xavier, I'm so sorry. I couldn't stay there after. Everywhere I looked, I saw him. Sold what was left of the ranch for barely anything and just started riding. Ended up here because my horse threw a shoe and I didn't have the strength to keep going. Been working odd jobs ever since, sending money back to my mother in Denver. She doesn't know about Lucas yet. I can't bring myself to write that letter." Without thinking, Hannah reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You're not responsible for what happened. Those raiders made their choices. I'm the older brother. I was supposed to protect him." Xavier's eyes met hers, and the grief there was so profound it took her breath away. He was just a kid with his whole life ahead of him. And he died protecting something he loved, someone he loved. That means something, even if it hurts. They sat there in the small restaurant, hands touching across the table, two wounded souls who'd found each other in the most unlikely place. Something shifted between them in that moment. An understanding, a connection that went deeper than the few hours they'd known each other. The telegraph operator found them an hour later with news that sent both hope and confusion through Hannah. A response had come from a town called Lordsburg, about 30 miles west. Someone matching Margot's description had been seen there 2 weeks ago, working at a hotel. Lordsburg, Hannah repeated. But why would she go there? And why would someone send me a telegram saying she was in Steins Pass? Xavier frowned. That's a good question. Could be they were mistaken about the town, or could be something else is going on. I have to go there, today if possible. Stage doesn't run to Lordsburg until tomorrow morning. Xavier was quiet for a moment, then said, "But I could take you. I've got a horse and access to a wagon. We could leave within the hour, be there by nightfall if we push hard." "You do that? Travel all that way with me?" He stood, his expression resolute in a way she hadn't seen before, as if he'd made a decision about something important. "I told you I'd help you find your sister. I meant it." They prepared quickly, Hannah packing a small bag with essentials and Xavier securing a wagon and team of horses. Mrs. Morrison provided them with food and water for the journey and made Hannah promise to send word once she found her sister. The ride to Lordsburg was long and hot, the sun beating down mercilessly as they traveled across the stark landscape. But it wasn't unpleasant. Xavier proved to be good company when he opened up, telling her stories about his ranch, about Lucas and the dreams they'd shared. Hannah found herself talking, too, about growing up in Santa Fe, about Margot's spirit and rebellion, about the pressure their father put on both his daughters to marry well. "You have someone waiting for you back home?" Xavier asked as they stopped to water the horses around midday. Hannah looked out at the shimmering heat waves dancing across the desert. "There's a gentleman my father approves of, a lawyer. He's perfectly suitable and perfectly boring. I'm 24, which by my father's reckoning means I'm dangerously close to being unmarriageable." She glanced at Xavier. "What about you? Before everything happened, was there anyone?" "There was a woman in the town near my ranch. Sarah. We'd been courting for about a year. She was a school teacher, smart and kind. After Lucas died, after I sold the ranch, I wrote her a letter explaining I was leaving. She deserved better than what I'd become. Maybe she should have had the choice." Xavier's expression was troubled. "Maybe, but I wasn't in any state to be what she needed. Still aren't." They arrived in Lordsburg as the sun was setting, tired and dusty. The town was larger than Steins Pass, with more buildings and more people. Xavier helped Hannah down from the wagon, his hands steady at her waist, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "The hotel should be on the main street," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Are you ready for this?" Hannah took a deep breath. "I have to be." The Lordsburg Hotel was a 2-story building with a faded sign and a front desk manned by a thin man with spectacles. Xavier did the talking, asking about a young blonde woman who'd been working there. The clerk's face brightened. "Oh, you must mean Mary. Sweet girl, worked here for about a week, But she left 4 days ago, said she was heading to Tucson. Hannah's heart sank again. Tucson? That's over 100 miles from here. Did she say why? Something about meeting someone there, I think. She was a bit secretive, to be honest, kept to herself mostly. The clerk paused. She did leave a letter, though, said if anyone came looking for her to give them this. He produced an envelope from beneath the counter, and Hannah's hands shook as she took it. Her name was written on the front in Margot's familiar handwriting. Xavier guided her to a chair in the hotel lobby while she opened the letter with trembling fingers. She read it once, then again, her emotions churning from relief to frustration to something approaching anger. "She's all right," Hannah said finally, looking up at Xavier. "She's with a man named Thomas, a photographer she met in Santa Fe before she left. They're planning to get married in Tucson. She apologizes for running, says she knows it was cowardly, but she couldn't face Father's disappointment. She asks me not to follow her, says she needs to make her own life." Hannah's voice cracked. "She thanks me for caring enough to look for her." Xavier knelt beside the chair, his presence solid and comforting. "At least you know she's safe, that she made her choice freely. I've been so worried, so terrified something terrible had happened, and she's been fine this whole time, running off with some photographer." Hannah wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. "I should be happy for her. Why aren't I just happy? Because you've spent 6 weeks scared out of your mind, and that doesn't just vanish because you got a letter, because you feel like she didn't trust you enough to tell you the truth." Xavier's hand found hers, because love and worry and anger can all exist together, and that's all right. Hannah looked at their joined hands, feeling something shift in her chest. "When did you become so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just familiar with complicated feelings." They got rooms at the hotel for the night, too exhausted to contemplate the journey back to Steins Pass until morning. But Hannah couldn't sleep, despite her weariness. She kept thinking about Margot's letter, about the relief and the lingering hurt of being left behind. And she kept thinking about Xavier, about the way he'd stayed by her side through all of this, asking nothing in return. Around midnight, unable to bear her own thoughts any longer, Hannah wrapped a shawl around her nightgown and stepped out onto the balcony that ran along the second floor. She found Xavier there already, leaning against the railing, staring up at the stars. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. He turned, and in the moonlight his face looked younger, less burdened. "Keep thinking about tomorrow, about going back to Steins Pass and the emptiness waiting there." Hannah moved to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "What will you do now? Same as before, I suppose. Take whatever work I can find. Send money to my mother. Try to figure out how to write that letter about Lucas." He was quiet for a moment. "What about you?" "You'll go back to Santa Fe." The thought of returning home, of resuming her old life as if these past weeks hadn't happened, made Hannah feel hollow. "I suppose I must. Father will want to know about Margot. Mother will want to know she's safe, even if she can't forgive her for the scandal." And the boring lawyer, despite everything, Hannah smiled. Probably still perfectly suitable and perfectly boring. Xavier turned to face her fully, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Hannah, I know I have no right to say this. I'm a man with nothing to offer. Just a drifter working odd jobs in a town that's barely a town. But these past 2 days with you, they've been the first time since Lucas died that I've felt like maybe there's still something worth living for. Like maybe I'm not just broken pieces that can't be put back together." Hannah's heart was pounding. "Xavier, I think I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I know it's too soon. I know it doesn't make sense, but I can't help it. When I'm with you, the darkness doesn't seem quite so dark. And I know you have to go back to your life, and I have no right to ask you to stay, but I needed you to know. I needed you to understand what you've done for me." For a moment Hannah couldn't speak, could barely breathe. Then she stepped forward and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his stubble, the warmth of his skin. "It's not too soon. It doesn't have to make sense. I feel it too. This connection between us, this thing that started the moment we met. I came here looking for my sister, and instead I found you." Xavier's arms came around her waist, pulling her close, and when he kissed her it felt like coming home. There was tenderness in the kiss, but also hunger, a desperate need to hold on to something good in a world that had dealt them both such painful blows. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Come back to Steins Pass with me. Not forever, not right away, but just for a little while. Give us time to see if this is real, if it's something that can last." Hannah knew she should say no, should be sensible and practical and think about what her family would say. But she was tired of being sensible. Tired of doing what was expected. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll come back with you." They stood on that balcony for hours, talking and kissing and making plans. Xavier told her about his dreams for the future, about maybe starting over somewhere, building a new ranch with new memories. Hannah told him about her love of books and music, about the small rebellions she'd engaged in throughout her life, the ways she'd tried to be more than just a proper lady waiting for a proper husband. When dawn broke over Lordsburg, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they finally returned to their separate rooms. But something fundamental had shifted between them, a commitment made even if the future was uncertain. The journey back to Steins Pass felt different than the journey out. They talked more freely now, their hands finding excuses to touch, their eyes meeting with understanding and promise. Hannah marveled at how much her life had changed in just a few days. She'd come west looking for Margot, ready to drag her sister home if necessary. Instead, she'd found a reason to stay. Mrs. Morrison saw it immediately when they returned to the boarding house. "Well now," she said with a knowing smile, "I see you two had an eventful trip." Hannah felt herself blushing but didn't look away. "I'd like to keep my room for a while longer if that's all right. A few more weeks at least. Stay as long as you need, dear." Hannah sent a telegram to her family that evening, explaining that Margot was safe and getting married in Tucson, that she was staying in New Mexico territory for a time to rest from her travels before returning home. She didn't mention Xavier, wasn't ready to try explaining something she barely understood herself. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt both strange and right. Xavier continued his work around town, but he spent every free moment with Hannah. They took long walks in the early morning before the heat became unbearable, exploring the harsh beauty of the landscape. They sat together in the evening on Mrs. Morrison's porch, talking about everything and nothing. Xavier began to open up more about Lucas, sharing memories that made him laugh as well as cry. Hannah listened and held his hand, understanding that he needed to process his grief, to find a way to honor his brother's memory without being crushed by guilt. One evening, about 2 weeks after their return from Lordsburg, Xavier arrived at the boarding house with paper and pen. "Help me write the letter to my mother," he said. "I can't do it alone, but with you here, maybe I can find the right words." They sat at Mrs. Morrison's dining table, and together they crafted a letter that was honest about Lucas's death, but also emphasized his bravery, his love for the ranch, his dreams for the future. Xavier's hand shook as he signed his name, and Hannah wrapped her arms around him from behind, offering silent support. "I should go to Denver," Xavier said after they'd sealed the letter. "Take it to her in person. She deserves that much." "Then I'll come with you," Hannah said without hesitation. Xavier turned in his chair to look at her. "Hannah, that's a long journey, and meeting my mother, that's a big step." "I know, but I want to meet the woman who raised someone like you, and I want to be there when you need me." He pulled her into his lap, holding her tight. "How did I get so lucky? How did a broken-down cowboy in a nothing town end up with someone like you?" Hannah kissed him softly. "I think we both got lucky. I think we found each other exactly when we needed to." They made plans to travel to Denver in another week, giving Xavier time to save enough money from his work for the journey. In the meantime, they continued to grow closer, learning each other's rhythms and habits. Hannah discovered that Xavier was patient and kind, that he had a dry sense of humor that surfaced when he was comfortable, that he was fiercely protective of those he cared about. Xavier learned that Hannah was stronger than she appeared, that she had a sharp mind and wasn't afraid to speak it, that she loved watching the sunrise and could identify dozens of plants and their medicinal uses. He learned that she hummed when she was happy and bit her lip when she was thinking hard about something. One afternoon, while they were sitting by the well in what passed for the town center, Hannah asked the question that had been on her mind. "Xavier, what happens after Denver? Where do we go from there?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the few clouds drift across the bright blue sky. "I've been thinking about that. I have some money saved from selling the ranch, more than I've let on. Enough to make a new start somewhere if I'm careful." He looked at her, his expression serious. "I know I should court you properly, wait a respectable amount of time, ask your father for permission. But Hannah, I already know what I want. I want to build a life with you. A real life, not just stolen moments." Hannah's heart felt too large for her chest. "I want that too, but my father will never approve. You're not wealthy, you're not from an established family, you're not any of the things he values." "Then don't ask his approval. Choose for yourself the way Margot did." Xavier took both her hands in his. "I'm not saying it will be easy, starting over never is, but we could do it together. Maybe find some land in Colorado or Montana, someplace with water and good grazing. Build something from nothing, just us." The dream he painted was so different from the life Hannah had always imagined for herself, the life of a proper wife in Santa Fe with servants and social calls and endless, tedious dinners. This would be harder, rougher, with no guarantees. But it would be real. It would be hers. "Yes," she said simply. "Let's do it. Let's build something together." Xavier kissed her right there in the middle of Steins Pass, not caring who saw, and Hannah kissed him back with all the hope and love and determination in her heart. They left for Denver 3 days later, taking the stage north with their few belongings. The journey took over a week, with stops in several towns along the way. During those long days of travel, they talked about their plans in more detail. Xavier wanted to focus on raising horses, which he knew well. Hannah suggested they could also keep chickens and a garden, maybe even some dairy cows eventually. "We'll need a house first," Xavier said practically. "Something small to start, but solid. I can do most of the building myself if I can hire help for the heavy work." "I can help too," Hannah insisted. "I'm stronger than I look." Xavier smiled at her determination. "I don't doubt that for a second." Denver was bigger than Hannah expected. A real city with paved streets and buildings that reached 3 and 4 stories high. Xavier's mother lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, a tidy place with flower boxes in the windows. Xavier stood on the front walk for a long moment, gathering his courage, and Hannah squeezed his hand. "I'm right here," she whispered. The woman who answered the door was in her 50s with Xavier's blue eyes and streaks of gray in her dark hair. She took one look at her son and burst into tears, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "Xavier, oh my boy, I've been so worried. Your letters were so brief, I could tell something was wrong." She pulled back, studying his face. "What's happened? And who is this lovely young woman?" They went inside, and over tea Xavier told his mother everything. About the raid, about Lucas's death, about selling the ranch and drifting until he ended up in Steins Pass. His mother wept for her younger son, and Xavier wept with her, finally letting out the grief he'd been carrying alone for so long. When the worst of the tears had passed, Xavier introduced Hannah properly. "Mother, this is Hannah Everly. She came to Steins Pass looking for her sister, and she found me instead. I love her, and I'm going to marry her if she'll have me. We're going to start over together, build something new." His mother looked at Hannah with red-rimmed eyes. "You love my son?" "With all my heart," Hannah said honestly. "He's the best man I've ever known." Xavier's mother reached out and took Hannah's hand. "Then welcome to our family, dear. God knows Xavier deserves some happiness after everything he's been through. You both do." They stayed in Denver for a week, and Hannah got to know Xavier's mother, Margaret. The older woman told stories about Xavier and Lucas as boys, about the trouble they'd gotten into, and the dreams they'd shared. It was bittersweet, honoring Lucas's memory while also celebrating the future that Xavier and Hannah were building. Before they left Denver, Xavier took Hannah to meet with a land agent. They spent hours looking at maps and discussing options, finally deciding on a parcel of land in the mountains west of Denver. It was 200 acres with a creek running through it, good grazing, and enough timber for building. The price was fair, and Xavier put down a deposit. "We can move there in the spring," he said as they walked back to his mother's house. "That gives us time to prepare, to gather supplies and livestock. We can spend the winter here in Denver, working and saving money. My mother would be happy to have us." But Hannah shook her head. "Your mother is wonderful, but I think we need our own space. What if we rent a small place here in town? We could both find work, and we'd have privacy to be together properly." Xavier stopped walking and pulled her close, right there on the Denver street. "Hannah Everly, will you marry me? I know I don't have a ring, and this isn't very romantic, but I can't wait another moment to ask you properly." Hannah felt tears pricking her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Yes, Xavier Easton. Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed 3 days later in a small ceremony at the local church, with Margaret as their witness and a handful of her friends in attendance. Hannah wore a simple blue dress she'd bought with the last of her traveling money, and Xavier had gotten his hair cut and looked heartbreakingly handsome in his one good suit. As they exchanged vows, Hannah thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. She'd set out from Santa Fe to find Margot, driven by duty and love and fear. She'd never expected to find her own happiness, her own future, with a wounded cowboy in a dusty town she'd never heard of before. But life, she was learning, had a way of surprising you, of giving you what you needed rather than what you thought you wanted. That night in the small apartment they'd rented on the edge of Denver, Xavier made love to his wife with a tenderness that brought tears to Hannah's eyes. He touched her like she was precious, like she was the answer to prayers he'd been too broken to voice. And Hannah gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, trusting him with all that she was. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, Hannah felt a peace she'd never known before. "I should write to my family," she said quietly. "Tell them I'm married. They'll be furious." Xavier's fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Do you regret it?" "Not for a single second. You're my family now. You and Margaret, whatever children we might have someday." She propped herself up to look at him. "I hope you know how happy you make me." His eyes were bright with emotion. "I spent so long thinking I'd lost everything worth having. That Lucas's death meant the end of any dream I'd ever had. But you showed me that starting over isn't about forgetting the past. It's about honoring it by building something new, something good." Winter in Denver was cold but bearable, and Hannah and Xavier settled into married life with surprising ease. They both found work, Xavier at a stable and Hannah taking in sewing and teaching reading to children at the church. Every penny they earned went into their savings for the ranch. Margaret was delighted to have family nearby again, and Sunday dinners at her house became a cherished tradition. She taught Hannah to make Xavier's favorite foods and shared more stories about his childhood. Xavier bloomed under the combined love of his wife and mother, the haunted look gradually fading from his eyes. Hannah did write to her family, a long letter explaining her choices and introducing Xavier. The response from her father was cold and brief, disowning her for her disgrace. But her mother wrote separately, a shorter note that said while she was disappointed, she hoped Hannah had found happiness. There was also a letter from Margot, full of joy and understanding. She and Thomas were married now and living in Tucson. She wrote that she was proud of Hannah for choosing love over duty. "You miss them?" Xavier asked when Hannah shared the letters with him. "I miss what I thought we had," Hannah admitted, "but I'm building something better now, something real." As winter gave way to spring, they prepared for the move to their land. Xavier bought lumber and supplies, tools and seed. They purchased 2 horses, 6 cows, and a dozen chickens. Margaret insisted on giving them furniture and household goods, things she said she no longer needed, but that Hannah suspected were sacrifices the older woman made to help them start their life. In late April, they loaded everything into a wagon and set out for their new home. The land was even more beautiful than Hannah remembered from the maps, with the creek running clear and cold through a valley surrounded by pine-covered mountains. The meadow where they planned to build the house was carpeted with wildflowers. "It's perfect," Hannah breathed, standing in the middle of what would become their ranch. Xavier came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "It will be once we build it. Are you ready for the work ahead? As long as we're together, I'm ready for anything." They set up a tent to live in while they built the house, and for the next 3 months, they worked from dawn to dusk. Xavier proved to be a skilled carpenter, and Hannah learned quickly, helping with everything from framing walls to laying floorboards. They hired 2 men from Denver to help with the heavy work, and slowly the house took shape. It was small, just 4 rooms and a loft, but it was solid and well built. Hannah insisted on a large kitchen with windows facing east for morning light. Xavier made sure the bedroom had a fireplace for cold mountain nights. They built a barn and chicken coop, corrals for the horses and cows. By the time August arrived, they were able to move into the house. It was sparsely furnished and rough around the edges, but it was theirs. That first night, lying in their new bed listening to the creek burble outside the window, Hannah felt a contentment so complete it almost frightened her. "Are you happy?" Xavier asked, his voice drowsy. "Happier than I ever imagined being," Hannah said honestly. "This life we're building, it's exactly what I needed even though I didn't know it." Xavier pulled her closer. "I never thought I'd have this again. A home, a partner, a future worth planning for. You gave me that, Hannah. You saved me." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. The ranch prospered over the following year. Xavier proved to be excellent with the horses, and word spread about his skill in breaking and training them. People came from as far as Denver to buy his stock. Hannah's garden flourished, and she learned to make cheese and butter from their dairy cows. They worked hard, but the work was satisfying in a way neither of them had experienced before. Margaret visited often, delighted to see her son thriving. Other neighbors began to settle in the area, and slowly a community formed. There were barn raisings and harvest festivals, Sunday services held in someone's barn until they could build a proper church. In the spring of 1884, nearly 2 years after Hannah first arrived in Steins Pass, she realized she was pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Xavier, wanting to be sure of the precious secret growing inside her. She told him one evening after supper, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Xavier, we're going to have a baby." He went completely still for a moment, then turned to her with wonder in his eyes. "A baby? You're certain?" "As certain as I can be. I think it will be born in late October." Xavier's face transformed with joy, and he pulled her into his arms carefully as if she might break. "Hannah, this is the most wonderful news, a child of our own." His voice cracked slightly. "Lucas would have been so excited to be an uncle." "We could name him Lucas if it's a boy," Hannah suggested softly, "to honor your brother's memory." Xavier's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Hannah found the summer heat challenging as her belly swelled. Xavier was endlessly attentive, taking on extra work so she could rest, making sure she had everything she needed. Margaret came to stay when Hannah entered her final month, declaring that her daughter-in-law needed an experienced woman around for the birth. Their son was born on a crisp October morning in 1884, arriving with a lusty cry that filled the small house with sound. Xavier, who had been pacing in the kitchen, rushed in the moment Margaret called him, his face white with worry. But when he saw Hannah holding their son, both of them alive and well, his expression transformed into pure love. "He's perfect," Xavier breathed, carefully taking the tiny bundle. "Hello, Lucas. Welcome to the world." Baby Lucas had his father's dark hair and his mother's determined expression. As Xavier held his son for the first time, Hannah saw the final pieces of his broken heart mend. The grief over his brother would always be there, but now it was balanced by joy, by hope, by the promise of new life and new beginnings. "Thank you," Xavier whispered to Hannah, leaning down to kiss her forehead, "for giving me a family again, for giving me a reason to believe in tomorrow." "Thank you for finding me when I needed you most," Hannah replied, "for showing me what real love looks like." The months after Lucas's birth were exhausting but wonderful. Hannah marveled at how Xavier took to fatherhood, holding their son for hours, singing to him in a rough voice that somehow always soothed the baby's cries. The ranch continued to prosper, and they were able to hire a young man from town to help with the work, giving Xavier more time to spend with his family. When Lucas was 6 months old, they received a letter from Margot. She and Thomas were expecting their first child as well, and she wrote that she hoped someday their children could meet, could grow up knowing their cousins. She also mentioned that she'd written to their mother, who had softened toward both her daughters now that grandchildren were on the way. "Would you want to go back to Santa Fe for a visit?" Xavier asked after reading the letter. Hannah considered it, watching their son sleep peacefully in his cradle. "Someday, perhaps. When Lucas is older, I'd like him to know where I came from, even if that's not where I belong anymore." She looked up at Xavier. "My home is here now. With you, with our son, with the life we've built." Xavier crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "I love you, Hannah Easton. I loved you from the moment you stepped off that stage in Steins Pass looking lost and determined and beautiful. Every day since then has only made me love you more." Hannah rose on her toes to kiss him. "I love you too. I came west looking for my sister, but I found so much more. I found purpose and partnership and a love I didn't even know was possible. You needed me, but I needed you just as much." That evening, with their son sleeping nearby and the fire crackling in the hearth, Hannah and Xavier made plans for the future. They talked about expanding the ranch, about having more children, about maybe one day opening their home to orphans or children who needed a place to belong, the way Lucas had once needed a place. "We could give them what we both found," Xavier said. "A second chance, a new beginning." Hannah smiled, thinking about how far they'd both come from that first meeting in Steins Pass. She'd been searching desperately for Margot, terrified and alone in a strange town. Xavier had been drowning in grief, unable to see past his loss. Somehow, impossibly, they'd found each other at exactly the right moment. Two broken people who fit together perfectly. The years passed in a blur of hard work and deep happiness. They had two more children, a daughter they named Margaret after Xavier's mother in 1886, and another son named Thomas in 1888. The ranch expanded, and Xavier's reputation as a horseman spread throughout Colorado. Hannah started teaching local children reading and writing in their home during winter months when farm work was slow. Margaret Easton Sr. remained a constant presence in their lives, doting on her grandchildren and helping Hannah whenever she could. She lived to see all three of her grandchildren grow past childhood, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1895 at the age of 71. At her funeral, Xavier spoke about how she'd raised him to be strong and compassionate, how she'd welcomed Hannah into the family without hesitation, how she'd given them her blessing to start fresh after tragedy. Margot and Thomas visited several times over the years, bringing their own growing family. The cousins played together during those precious visits, and the sisters would stay up late talking, marveling at how different their lives had turned out from what their father had planned for them. Both had found happiness by following their hearts rather than following expectations. In 1892, a decade after their wedding, Hannah and Xavier made the journey back to Santa Fe. Their mother, who had been writing more frequently over the years, had become ill, and Hannah wanted to see her before it was too late. Their father had died 2 years earlier, and their mother had softened considerably without his stern presence. The reunion was bittersweet. Their mother wept to see her daughters and meet her grandchildren, apologizing for not being strong enough to stand up to their father when they were young. Hannah forgave her, understanding now how complicated family dynamics could be, how love and duty could sometimes conflict. They stayed in Santa Fe for 3 weeks, showing their children where Hannah had grown up. But Hannah was relieved when it was time to return to Colorado, to their ranch and the life they'd built. Santa Fe was her past, but the ranch was her future. On the journey home, with their children sleeping in the back of the wagon and the stars brilliant overhead, Xavier reached for Hannah's hand. "Do you ever regret it, giving up your old life for this one?" Hannah didn't hesitate. "Never, not for a single moment. My old life was comfortable but empty. This life is hard sometimes, but it's real, it's mine, ours. I still can't believe sometimes that you chose me," Xavier said quietly. "A broken-down cowboy with nothing to offer but hard work and a dream." "You had everything to offer," Hannah corrected. "You had honesty and kindness and strength. You had a heart big enough to love me even when you were still grieving. You had the courage to try again after losing everything." She squeezed his hand. "I'm the lucky one, Xavier. I came looking for my sister and found a cowboy who needed me, but who also saw that I needed him just as much. We saved each other." Xavier brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "Here's to the next 10 years and the 10 after that and all the years we get together." By the time their children were grown, the ranch had become one of the most successful in the region. Lucas, their oldest, took over the horse breeding operation and expanded it further. Margaret, their daughter, married a neighboring rancher's son and settled nearby. Thomas, their youngest, became a veterinarian, the first in the family to attend university, though he returned to work with the horses he'd loved since childhood. Hannah and Xavier grew old together, their hair turning silver, their hands becoming weathered from decades of hard work. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew deeper, richer. tempered by years of facing challenges together and celebrating triumphs together. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. As Hannah looked around at the family they'd created, the legacy they'd built, she felt overwhelming gratitude for that telegram that had brought her to Steins Pass all those years ago. After the party, when it was just the two of them again in the house they'd built with their own hands, Xavier pulled Hannah into his arms. They danced slowly in the kitchen with no music but the memory of a lifetime together. "I would do it all again," Xavier said, his voice still deep despite his age. "Every moment, every struggle, every joy, as long as it led me to you." Hannah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. That telegram said Margot was in Steins Pass, but she wasn't. "I used to wonder who sent it, why they gave me the wrong information. But now I think maybe it wasn't wrong at all. Maybe it was exactly what was supposed to happen. Maybe I was meant to go to Steins Pass, meant to find you." "Fate," Xavier murmured. "Love," Hannah corrected. "The kind that finds you when you need it most, in the most unexpected places, with the most unexpected people." They stood there swaying gently. Two people who'd been strangers once, who'd found each other in a desperate search for something else entirely, who'd built a life so full and rich that it sometimes took their breath away. Hannah had gone looking for her runaway sister and found a cowboy who needed her more. But what she'd really found was herself, her purpose, her place in the world. She'd found a partner who saw her not as a duty or a prize, but as an equal. She'd found a love that transformed them both, that healed old wounds and created new joys. As the years continued to pass, Hannah and Xavier remained devoted to each other and to the family they'd created. They watched their grandchildren grow, saw some of them take over various aspects of the ranch while others pursued different paths. The land they'd claimed in 1883 had become a thriving enterprise, but more importantly, it had become a home filled with love and laughter. Xavier's health began to fail in his late 70s, the old wounds from the raid finally catching up with him. Hannah cared for him tenderly, and he faced his declining strength with grace, grateful for every day he'd been given beyond the night Lucas died. "I got so much more than I deserved," he told Hannah one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, just as they'd done thousands of times before. "I got you. I got our children. I got to see my family grow and thrive. Lucas would be happy, I think. Happy that something good came from all that pain." Hannah held his hand, these days more fragile than the strong, work-worn hand that had first helped her down from the stage in Steins Pass. "He'd be proud of you, proud of the man you became, the father you were, the life you built." Xavier passed peacefully in his sleep in 1917 at the age of 78, surrounded by family in the house he'd built for his bride 34 years earlier. Hannah mourned him deeply, but she didn't fall apart. He taught her to be strong, to face whatever came with courage and grace. She lived another 12 years, watching her grandchildren have children of their own, seeing the ranch continue to prosper under Lucas's management. She spent her days working in her garden, teaching great-grandchildren to read, and writing in the journal she'd kept since that first day in Steins Pass. When Hannah Easton died in 1929 at the age of 71, she was surrounded by 4 generations of family. Her last words were about Xavier, about how she couldn't wait to dance with him again, to tell him everything he'd missed, to hold his hand and know they'd never have to be parted again. They buried her next to Xavier on a hill overlooking their ranch, the mountains rising purple in the distance, the creek still babbling its eternal song. Her tombstone read simply, "Hannah Easton, beloved wife, mother, grandmother." She came looking for her sister and found a love that lasted forever. Because that was the truth of it. Hannah had set out on a journey to find Margot, driven by duty and desperation. She'd followed a false lead to a dusty town in New Mexico, exhausted and afraid. And there, in the most unlikely place, she'd found Xavier Easton, a broken man who needed her just as much as she needed him. Their love story wasn't the one she'd expected. It didn't follow any of the rules she'd been taught about proper courtship and suitable matches. It was messy and complicated, born from grief and search and chance. But it was real. It was powerful. It was the kind of love that transforms people, that heals wounds and creates legacies. Years after both were gone, their great-grandchildren would tell the story of how Hannah and Xavier met, how a telegram about a runaway sister led to a love that spanned decades and created a family that stretched across the West. They'd talk about the ranch that still bore the Easton name, about the values of hard work and devotion that Hannah and Xavier had instilled in every generation that followed. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the mountains and the creek sang its ancient song, people swore they could see two figures on the old porch, dancing slowly with no music but the memory of a lifetime together, proving that some loves are strong enough to echo through eternity, reminding us all that sometimes the things we need most find us when we're searching for something else entirely.